me. In spite of all, I still believe we are all in this together. Yes, it's true. I believe in love. I believe in you.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Mixtape with Scott. I am your host, Scott Cunningham, professor of economics at Baylor University. And this week I am excited to have someone. I'm always excited to have people on the show. This week I'm excited times 1.5. So this is a good friend of mine. You've heard of him. Probably some of you have heard of him, Andrew Goodman-Bacon at the Federal Reserve. Andrew, for those of you who know him, he's an economic historian. He's also the author of a paper that was published in the Journal of Econometrics a couple of years ago that sort of has been one of several articles written on the problems with a traditional way of estimating programs and laws using the two-way fixed effects estimator when you're doing difference and differences. And paper has been highly impactful, highly influential. And it's my pleasure to have him on the show. He's a good friend of mine, and I've come to love him very much. I think anybody that knows him loves him very much. And this was a wonderful interview. So I'm not going to really say much more than that. Just wanted to say thank you again for tuning into the show. Thank you for all your support. Thank you for sharing. I encourage you to share this with your friends. Share this with your family. You're going to hear the story of someone that probably didn't really like economics at the beginning and came around to the dark side. So hope that you guys enjoy it. Have a great week. Okay, well, it is such a delight to have on the podcast someone who has become a really good friend that I care a lot about. Why don't you introduce yourself to the audience? Tell us your name, your title, and who pays your paycheck.
Great. I am Andrew Goodman-Bacon, and if I meet you in person, you can call me Bacon if you'd like. And I'm a senior economist at the Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute at the Minneapolis Fed, who pays my paycheck. But I guess I get some teeny little side paycheck for teaching 7 weeks of econometrics at the University of Minnesota.
Oh, okay, cool. All right, well, great. Now, this is Andrew Goodman-Bacon. A lot of people listening actually know exactly who you are, and they're so excited to tune in, and I'm so excited to talk to you. Before we get started, could you tell me what is, as an icebreaker, what's one of your favorite vacations you had as a kid that to this day you still kind of think about every now and then?
Yeah, so I think a lot about just like a style of vacation that we used to take. So I grew up, not all the time, but for kindergarten to 8th grade, we lived outside of Seattle. And my parents are both from Michigan. So a lot of vacations were like, go to Michigan and do chores for my grandma, which was, that was fun. Like my mom's mom is from the central UP, and she lived in a house right on a beautiful inland lake, and she had a sauna there. And so, there were chores to do, but it's a beautiful, fun place to go. So it was just kind of a lot of like family time up there, and then just like pitching in and helping out with stuff that she needed.
You're the first person who, when I ask, tell me about your favorite vacation, you tell me you were doing chores.
We did a lot of chores, vacation chores.
What kind of chores are you doing for your grandma? She lived on the water? Is that what you said? She lived on the water?
Yeah, she lived on there's like an inland lake. It's like sort of right in the central UP. So it was, like there's maintenance stuff around a house. I remember once my mom and I installed like a electric fence like for dogs, because everybody on the side of the family had dogs and they wanted to bring their dogs up there, and they were all like trained on the little electric fence. And so she and I had to dig rent a machine and dig this like thin little trench to put the wire underground, and we got stung by bees. And
oh gosh,
it was a memory.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. So you grew up really close with your family, it sounds like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
definitely.
Awesome. Well, so let's get started. So you grew up in Seattle.
Yeah, so I was born in Minneapolis, actually.
Oh,
I think maybe from where I'm sitting in my office next to the Mississippi River, I can see the hospital where I was born
oh,
right now.
wow. Yeah.
But we lived here only for a little while, and then we moved outside of Philadelphia for a year or so. I lived outside of Ann Arbor actually when I was about in preschool. And then we moved to Seattle, and I was there from kindergarten until the end of eighth grade.
Oh,
And then we moved back. We moved to Ann Arbor after that. So I went to high school in Ann Arbor. Yeah,
oh. Was that a hard move, moving in the eighth grade?
I was pretty happy about it in some
Oh,
ways.
really?
I mean, I had friends that I missed there, but I had gone to I did like a gifted elementary school thing, and it was not at my neighborhood school; it was at a different school,
Yeah.
and that was like an excellent experience. The peer effects were fun. I really liked the people that I knew there. I learned a ton. I mean, it was great. It was like probably a part of my, I probably cemented part of my like conception of myself, and that it was centered around, you know, academic achievement stuff.
Oh, yeah. What
Um,
kind of student were you as a kid? So you were super
uh,
smart. You were going to like a super smart school.
yeah, it was like within the public school district. We lived in like super suburban sprawl area outside of Seattle. So now it's called Sammamish, but it wasn't called Sammamish when I lived there. It was called unincorporated King County.
Uh-huh.
And we lived like this is like the absolute forefront of like newly built subdivisions. It was a lot of like Microsoft people because this was like
Oh,
in between Redmond and Issaquah.
yeah.
And like the first half of the time we lived there, my backyard was just these big woods, and I'd go back there and
Oh, man. Yeah.
I was a Dungeons and Dragons kid, and I would like,
Uh,
I had this like a pocket knife, and I would try to throw this pocket knife into a log like for hours and hours at a time with a hit rate of like 4%.
right.
And then second half that land got bought and turned into new homes,
Uh-huh.
which had a little fun chunk of time where it was a construction site, and there's a lot of like D&D stuff at
Yeah.
construction sites too. So I'd go play back there.
You what with your
Um,
buddies? You had like a buddy of some buddies that doing D&D. I'm sorry, this
oh
cat.
yeah,
This
oh,
I've
that's
got a
great.
cat that's all over me right now. You had you were really into Dungeons and Dragons with some close friends?
Yeah, it was awesome. I mean, I have like really good memories of that. I just actually like reconnected with a friend from that time period, who still plays D&D, and like my kids are kind of interested in it a little bit. And I just thought it was great. Like it totally hinged on my friend David's older brother being cool and willing to DM for us
Yeah.
and patient, and like I don't know. I remember him being like the definition of a cool guy.
Hmm.
Not to say that's wrong, but I thought he was a cool guy. And he had the willingness, he had the creativity, he had the patience to kind of get us all into it and shepherd us in. And it's like a fun thing to do because
Yeah.
it's totally completely wide open.
Yeah.
There's like these really interesting restrictions on how interactions have to go, but
Mm.
it's like you can be as creative as you want. It was really fun. So remember like staying up late in basements playing D&D, and
Oh,
then you can parlay that into like fun times in the woods, and it was
oh
really cool.
man.
Yeah.
That was really that's not some of that is so similar to my growing up that it's impossible to throw that knife into a
It's
log.
really hard. I know. I
You
know.
have to have a special knife. I think it's got to be weighted. Everything in the movies and stuff where they would be like hit it every time. I'd be like, what is wrong with
No,
my knife? It's impossible.
I know it's that like heavy, like Swiss Army knife base does not want to stick into the log.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, Dungeons and Dragons is it's so romantic because it's real creative, but it's really facilitates a lot of friendship.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Because you kind of have to trust the people you're with to open up your creativity to them.
yeah, yeah.
You know,
They say the psychological sense of community is a small group of people that meet regularly with a common purpose, and I can imagine Dungeons and Dragons fits that perfectly.
absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. I like that definition.
I know it creates, it's almost like community. When you believe in that definition, community is almost like deterministic. You can't avoid it if you're just meeting regularly with a common purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you did that and then you had to leave. You left Seattle. You were around all those woods and stuff. What was it like in Ann Arbor?
That was great. I mean, so so that I went to like my neighborhood junior high school. I went to elementary school through sixth grade. and then back to the neighborhood school. And I knew kids in my neighborhood too. That was fun. But it was, like it was one of these situations where lots of schools are feeding into a higher level school.
Yeah.
And I like had gone to a different place than the other feeder schools. So I didn't love junior high, but it wasn't like traumatic or awful. It
Right.
just felt like a little outsiderness. And so I wasn't too sorry to move somewhere where I was, it was like going to be normal to be new,
Right.
entering high school in a new
Yeah.
place.
I see what you're saying.
So there wasn't like this little backstory of like, oh, well, you went to this other weird school.
Yeah.
It was just like, oh, you're just a new kid. And
Everybody was
this was like
everybody
1997.
was kind of a stranger in the eighth grade almost.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
And I like had, I don't know. I mean, this was so after I moved on from D&D, I had another kind of like junior high school crew, and we'd rock climb a lot, which was a really fun thing to do, especially when you're like a scrawny little 110-pound seventh grader, because you can do things that like these strong guys can't do when you're little.
Oh
like
yeah,
that.
totally right.
And Seattle was like lousy with that stuff, and so we could like ride our bikes into town and go climb at this park for free, and that was another like it was just this great pivot from one wholesome thing to a different wholesome thing.
Yeah.
So when we moved to Ann Arbor, I was like, yeah, I'm going to lean into this. It's 1997. So bleached my hair, strapped on my puka shell necklace, and I like strolled in ready to be the coolest guy in the new
That's
school.
awesome. You're kind of a survivor. It sounds like you're like a social survivor. You can adapt really easily. Is that right?
I think so. Although when I think back to it, I think I was sort of like a shy or standoffish more than I am now. I think I've like been fortunate to know and love a lot of extroverted people who have spent time being like, well, how do they do it? And I can't quite totally pull it off, but I've become more comfortable being that way now than I was before.
You seem like you enjoy being a friend. Is that accurate?
Oh, definitely. And I think it's like something that I've thought more explicitly about as I've gotten older. Like, what does it mean? What is important to it? What is important to me about being a friend or having friends? And, like there have been times where I reached out to friends because I needed support for something, and they were just there. They just picked up the phone and listened and like showed me a lot of love. And that made a huge impression on me, both in terms of like it's out there for me, and then what it would be, how important it is to be that person who picks up the phone.
Right. So you made a good group of friends. You mentioned you're in high school, everybody's new. So in some ways it's like the social networks haven't really been formed yet.
Yeah.
So you kind of sorted into some more outdoorsy kind of stuff.
Well, in Ann Arbor, it was like I got there, I played soccer too. And so I got there, and that was like I didn't used to when back in the D&D days, I didn't go, no one called me Bacon. People actually people called me GB back then. I don't know why that's what it was. And I got to Ann Arbor. I remember I went there with my dad like 3 weeks before we all moved, I needed to try out for a soccer team, and there were like house things to get settled. And he and I lived in this like extended stay hotel for 3 weeks. And it was, it was like a unique little chunk of time. And I went to go try out for this soccer team. And this guy who became a friend of mine was just like, oh, hey, we're going to call you Bacon. And then they did. So I did I played soccer. It's a great nickname.
It's a great nickname.
I know. I mean, once you explain it, it's hard to forget.
Yeah. You're like,
and kids like it too. Little kids really think it's funny.
Yeah. No, it's great. It's great having a nickname.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's not everybody gets to have one. And so it's like, it's great it's your name too, but it's like, it's fun being called. I always have loved being called by my last name. I like, because it's kind of a term of affection a little bit. Yeah, or even kind of respect. It's like, depends on who says it, but it's like either it's respectful or it's like affectionate. Yeah. So what were you saying? I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh no, I was just like, I played soccer. I grew up playing violin. So I like played in the orchestra. That was like just one class in school too. And then, like I found a group of high school friends who I really had a lot of fun with too. It was great. I mean, I really liked those guys.
So you pick up an instrument in high school? Because I was going to ask you about that. You sort of have a natural musical talent.
I started playing violin when I was like 4, or like even before a little bit before. I mean, when you're 3 and you start playing violin, you get a little cardboard box. I had a Cracker Jack box with like wood paneled contact paper on it and a ruler, because you gotta put your hand in a weird position. It's not,
Hmm.
it's the way you need to do it to play the violin correctly, but it's not supernatural. So little kids just need to get the physical part down. Um, but I grew up playing that way, like lessons and like little community orchestras when I was younger. And it was great. I mean, it was a slog for a bunch of it. There were lots of times where like I didn't feel like doing it. But you know, my parents encouraged me to stick with it. And I'm super glad I did because it was a skill that had a lot of pieces that were transferable to other instruments and other kinds of music that I like playing now. And I'm sure I wouldn't be able to do those things if I didn't have this like this huge base of experience and knowledge playing violin.
Yeah. So wait, is it most of you have a bunch of instruments? Are they all string instruments?
Yeah, we have drums now. And then I sort of like picked up a little bit of drum, nothing great. So basically, what happened is like towards the end of high school, I had a bunch of friends who were starting to play guitar, and they were playing like "Wish You Were Here," Pink
Uh-huh.
Floyd, uh, Redemption Song, anything with a little like flat picking and like easy strumming, and they
Uh-huh.
were okay at it. And I remember thinking like, well, rather than listening to you kind of hack through these songs, why don't I hack through them? And then the summer between high school and college, I hurt my knee playing soccer, and I had a knee surgery. And I was just in bed. I had nothing to do all summer long. I think I watched like the Ken Burns jazz documentary, and I read, and I just sat around and just noodled on the guitar all summer because I was just physically stuck there. And it
Right.
was a huge like level up in my ability to noodle around on things, and that was great. I mean, then I got to college and played in like bands in college, and
It was that
um,
at college is your first time to be in a band?
yeah, I wasn't really in a band in high school because this was all happening like at the end of my senior year. But it
Mm.
was fun to be able to reproduce music that I was listening to, which at the time was like a lot of Grateful Dead and jam bands and stuff, and 60s rock. And then in college I was in some bands. That was really fun. That was a good way to like get to know people. And then in grad school, my wife Saye and I were in a band with professors at Michigan for like 7 years. And then at Vanderbilt, we were the professors in a band with a student. And
Mm.
so actually now that takes us almost to now. And I'm like, that's one of the things I miss most is being in a band.
Because so is it you miss being in the band? I'm just now piecing kind of together just a hypothesis. Like the social part's a big part of being in a band.
Yeah, that's part of it too. And then I think I get a lot of expression out through music too. You
Yeah.
know, like you can feel your feelings when you're yelling a song or doing, things can be, I don't know, it's just a way to get stuff out. It's like, it's very cathartic a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And these are all just like cover bands, we're just playing songs that we like.
Mm.
But I don't know, it feels really good to me to be able to do that. And I miss it a lot.
So you end up going to college. Where do you end up going to college?
I went to McAllister College, which is in St. Paul. I don't think I'm looking the right way from my window to see it from here, but yeah, I mean, it was like, I remember knowing, I didn't really know much about, I guess people applied to a ton of colleges. I applied to like 5 places, I think.
Uh,
And, we had visited, my aunt lives in Minneapolis. And so I spent a lot of time here just on visits as a kid.
yeah.
And we'd go by when we lived here, my parents knew people who had gone to McAllister. And so it was a known quantity in my life a little bit. And I thought it was cool. I thought the whole idea of liberal arts stuff sounded pretty cool. To be honest, I was like psyched to go to college because I was not going to have to take any more math.
No, you
I
didn't
was like,
like math in high
no,
school.
in high school, not, I mean, I did it, but I didn't love it. And I just don't think I was like emotionally prepared to understand it fully. I could kind of get through it, but I didn't have the love for it.
Right.
And so I went to McAllister. It was great. I mean, it totally changed my life. I think there's lots of things I wouldn't be doing any of this right now if I hadn't gone to McAllister for sure.
What happened at McAllister that was so life transforming?
Uh, well, I was like I said, I wasn't wanting to do math or like hard science stuff. I'd always been pretty interested in policy and anti-poverty policy. I think there was something vague about inequality and poverty that I thought was like bothered me, but I didn't really have a good way to focus like things I could do into that thing that I was on my mind and I cared about. And I got there and I took I took a lot of classes in the first year. I remember taking like this urban studies course that was one of these meets once a week, 3 hour long things. And it was taught by this guy named George Latimer, who had been the mayor of St. Paul, some decade or so before. And it was a ton of guest speakers. It was cool. It was like a really good intro to just a lot of issues,
Mm.
and a lot of people with experience coming to tell you firsthand about stuff, which was cool. That was exciting. But it didn't really like lead to like, here's a method you can use to go down this path.
Ah.
Um, but and at the same time, I took an econ class that was called Economics for the Citizen.
Oh.
And it was pitched as like, here's an econ class. It's all about these economic ideas, but we're not going to do any of the math, or there's not going to be hard graphs or anything like that. And it was co-taught by, I think he was the chair of the department at that time, this guy, Vasant Sukhatme, who was like a micro theorist, and Mike McPherson, who was the president of Macalester. He was like they were both Chicago guys.
Mm.
Um, and I mean, I think now I could probably formulate proper constructive criticisms of the class, but I could not at the time because I hated it and I misunderstood almost everything about it. And I did poorly in it, and I just kind of embarrassed myself. Actually, the TA of that class was an environmental economist at Berkeley now named Jim Salee, who's just like a brilliant guy. And I found some of the essays I wrote for it recently, and they had already been through the Jim filter, which made them way better, and they were still like not very good at all. So I took this class and I spent my whole first year like ranting kind of about how economics is horrible. Economists are like these crass like automatons. I hated everything about it. And I had I had some friends who I think just got kind of sick of it, and they're like, "Look, if you really hate it so much, you should actually take proper intro course, so you know what you're talking about."
Oh, were they in econ?
Yeah, so Macalester has a ton of international students, and a lot of, I remember once hearing this. Someone asked this guy once, like, "Well, why do all the international students major in economics?" And he was like, "What do you think we're going to do? Come here and major in American history?" So they weren't all economists, but they were taking econ classes. They were more so than I was at the time.
Right.
So I got in. I took the principles with a professor named Sarah West, who's like I love and I still am close with. And she was like, she's a great economist. She's like a wonderful person. She's an awesome communicator. She's a fantastic teacher. And I think it was her. I think it was her like rigor plus personality that brought me along. And so I was like, okay, I can dig into this from Sarah. And I remember really distinctly reading just pretty simple. This is like 2002. So we're kind of like in the first chunk of research coming out about the 1996 welfare reform. And that had been on my, that was happening when I was forming some of these preferences
Right.
and these interests, but I didn't know the political rhetoric about it was very identity based. It got really nasty. It felt messy.
Right.
And then when I saw someone put a kinked looking budget constraint up and say, well, welfare reform did this, or it added this change to someone's choice set,
Right.
I thought this is great. I mean, I really liked it, and the reason I liked it is because it felt fair in a sense because it was like anybody who had a low wage and found themselves on this part of their budget constraint and had convex preferences would do something similar to this. It's not about who you are. It's just it felt like a cleaner way to think about the choices involved,
Yeah.
and it linked up with data in a really nice way. And so that kind of scratched this itch and at the same time provided a tool and a method. And I really liked that. So I got that got me starting to turn my attitude around a little bit.
Mm.
And I kind of kept going. And then it was fortunate to be followed. It's kind of like I needed two or three good ones in a row. And I took a class about like comparative economic systems after that, which I just was interesting. That was kind of like global history, comparative, like comparing. It was taught by a guy who named Gary Kruger, who I also really like, who got his PhD in 1989 in the field. His field was Soviet economics.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
So then he became a transition economist, and he had super interesting,
Yeah.
on the ground, just practical stuff to say. It was great. So I had a couple of good experiences in a row, and that just started to get me on this track of like, well, actually, I do like this, and I was doing okay in it. So I was like, and I can do it, and I kept on going that way.
Yeah. 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 So but it's really close to applied work and it's really close to poverty.
Yeah.
This just in econ, it's like It's the three, it's kind of the three things. And this kind of something you're saying about this you're talking about models too.
Yeah, I mean, that was an important part of organizing your thinking about what people might do and why. Like, why would we think this would even happen?
Right.
So yeah, that was important too.
Yeah. So you apply to grad school. Are you when do you if you hadn't ended up doing that econ, do you think you still would have wanted to go to grad school? And what would you have majored? What would have been?
Yeah, I think I would have done something. I don't know. Maybe I would have tried to go like a law school route, something like that. Because I did care about like the policy side. So I think I would have tried to find something that would have got me involved in analyzing or influencing or talking about policy in some way.
Right.
But I don't know what it would have been. I don't know. I mean, I, it's really hard counterfactual for me to think through because I don't know how much of my like what I find satisfying about econometrics or using data or using economics to think about these policies. I don't know how much of that just comes from having been in it so long. Maybe I would feel the same way about legal analysis if that's what I had done. I don't know, but I think it would have been something like that. But I didn't go right to grad school. I was working on I worked on a senior thesis really hard about welfare reform. I was trying to figure out like the problem. There are two-way fixed effects problems with analyzing welfare reform, which actually were kind of like hinted at in this really interesting little AR P&P by Jonah Gelbach, Hilary Hoynes, and Marion Bitler. But the other thing that's hard, even independent of like the econometric stuff, is just that it happened in the late 90s, which is like a huge labor demand shift outward for low income workers, low skill labor. And so by the time I was studying it, 2004-ish, we had already had the 2001 recession. So I was trying to see if I could use that recessionary period to separate out like how much did the policies do and how much did the economy really do. So I worked really hard on that. And so that was a major preoccupation because during my senior year, right just prior to my senior year, my dad died of pancreatic cancer.
Mm.
And that was hard. I mean, that was hard to know what to do. Like, should I stay at school or should I go home? How to spend my time. I mean, that level of grief was totally new
And
to me. I didn't know how to handle that.
happened fast. That would have been.
Yeah, he was diagnosed in August 2004 and he died in October 2004.
Oh, Andrew, I'm
Um,
sorry.
well, it was interesting. I mean, yeah, so that was going on. And one of the practical things that it did for my trajectory is that it left me like no bandwidth to think about and apply for jobs at the time that everybody else was doing it. I was grieving and I was preoccupied and I was working on this honors thesis. So I didn't apply for stuff right away. And I wound up moving back to Ann Arbor for the summer after I graduated. And then I applied to a job at the Spencer Foundation, which is like an education kind of foundation research place, which was actually then headed by Mike McPherson, who taught that first class that I did so badly in. That was in Chicago. He did not hire me, but I remember at this time, I was kind of like, this is like late in the undergrad hiring cycle time. He was like, oh, well, I have a friend at the Chicago Fed who they actually hired an RA, but that person backed out of the deal to go take some other job. So they weirdly have an opening at a time they normally would not have one. And I think this was even like when I was in Chicago interviewing for this job. So I went over to the Fed and interviewed for this RA position and wound up getting an RA job at the Chicago Fed, which was a better job than I was even trying to get. I mean, I was really lucky to get that one. And that was another kind of watershed. I think like McAllister was an important thing. Taking Sarah's class was important. This was really important in keeping me on this trajectory. Otherwise, I could have gone another direction at that point too.
You don't go straight to grad school. You work at the Chicago Fed for a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we worked there for 2 years. And that was a ton of practical just knowledge and lessons. Like I remember printing out someone's do file, some short little do file, and writing in pen like what every line of the do file did, because I was pretty new to Stata coding as well.
Yeah.
And I worked there, it was a total typical Fed job in that I got special sworn status and I worked on some RDC projects. I got drawn into some really interesting stuff about the EITC and consumption with Leslie McGranahan. And I just got a bunch of coding skills. I got experience with data. I took classes, I took math classes that I didn't have at that point, and yeah, it was excellent. I mean,
Mm,
it was a really good experience, and it was a perfect. I mean, those jobs are like fantastic springboards for grad school applications.
yeah. How come? What? You just look so good on paper?
Yeah, and they're known quantities. I think everybody knows like what the selection is on the front end of like hiring Fed RAs. They're good jobs, so you can pick people who are good to begin with.
Yep.
And then the mentorship and the experience is like real human capital.
Right.
So I think people coming from Fed jobs can say with a lot of specificity, I can do this, or I
Right.
worked on this, and that's really helpful.
Right. 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 So you go there for a couple of years. And I mean, it's kind of interesting that you're going to end up back at Michigan and that's where you go to high school. But I mean, you probably had a lot of options. How come you picked Michigan?
Well, I don't know. I didn't. I mean, I had some options. I guess I think I got into Texas and Maryland, I
Mm,
think, and I don't remember what the money situation was. I want to say none of them gave me money, or one of them gave me a little bit of money, but I
mm,
definitely took loans in my first year of grad school. But I wanted to go to Michigan because Rebecca Blank worked there, and she
ah,
was the person who had written those like TANF articles that we were reading in my principal's class.
yeah.
So I was really eager to work with her, and she actually sadly just died this year. So she was someone who I'd met once or twice just in office meetings.
Yeah.
But still, even despite not a lot of meetings, she had a huge effect on like what I was interested in and getting me into economics and bringing me to Michigan. But I actually never overlapped with her because she left Michigan
Like,
before I got there
yeah.
immediately. Yeah. So
He goes become provost immediately or something.
I think I can't remember if she went right to Wisconsin or she did something else. But she was gone when I got there.
I see. And
So
what
you know, it
years,
was
but like 06, 07?
yeah. I started at the Chicago Fed in like the summer of 2005,
Uh-huh.
late summer, early fall. And then it was yeah, and then it was like, yeah, 2007. So my first year of grad school was 07, 08, which
Oh,
I think about this too. Like, think about how lucky that timing is, right? This is like the beginning of the Great Recession, and I've just entered this protected little cove of
yeah.
grad school where I'm not subject to the labor market at all. I mean, it could have been any number of years on either side of that, and another completely different trajectory.
Totally, totally, totally. So you get it, Michigan, Rebecca Blank's not there. You must be a little bummed, but then, so what you kind of pivot because you're this survivor. I mean, it's the story I'm kind of thinking in my head. And so you pivot and what was that first year like? What professors?
Oh, well, you know, the first year, I wasn't going to be talking to her and doing research first year anyway. So it's just time to like do your first year stuff.
Yeah.
Um, and, you know, that was fun. I mean, I don't think about a lot of those things anymore. But you know, there's a lot of discussion like what should be taught in grad school. And for me, there was some value in doing these problems,
Mhm.
learning these, learning, you know, economic theory at the level of a first year PhD that even though I don't do it on a day-to-day basis, it was like, here's a way to think. Here's like what a level of rigor looks like. And that was helpful. I think that was a useful thing.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so it's just like trying to get through those classes. And you know, there were some I was like maybe medium level prepared for it.
Yeah.
I wasn't like having to do tons of catch up, but there were people who were coming in just like acing stuff. Actually, I remember at something where this development guy named Gautam Rao was like a master's student at that time, and he was taking all our PhD classes and just smoking everybody.
Ah,
So there were some really good people at
ah,
that first year type of stuff.
yeah, 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 yeah. So you end up though, kind of the two people I kind of think of when I think of you there. I think John Dinardo and Martha Bailey. You sort of end up becoming close with both of them. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. Because
Ah,
so what happened is like um, uh, my second year, I took labor and public finance. Um, and so that was like I was getting the sort of Michigan labor treatment. I had John Bound, I had Charlie Brown. I had a really wonderful chunk of like macro labor kind of search theory stuff from Mike Ellsby, who's at Edinburgh now, who I think, despite everybody that I'm happy to talk about, who I love so much, I think Mike was the best professor I had for anything.
mm,
Like you couldn't get out of Mike's class without understanding what he wanted you to understand. He was so good. So there was like a little chunk where I was doing some macro stuff and some search theory stuff, and I was like kind of getting it, and that was exciting. I thought it was cool, and I thought the search aspect was a super realistic thing to add to a modeling exercise. And so when I saw that this is a new framework for thinking about how labor markets function, and it's based on like a deeply realistic thing that happens, like people need to meet and there's bargaining.
Right.
I really liked that a lot. I thought that was very cool. I remember I took this like topics course with Miles Kimball that was, it was like all these theorems that he had devised about that. Like, you know how sometimes you have a problem and one way to tackle it is to solve like a smaller problem and try to work up to it. I think what I learned is that Miles's solution was to solve like a much larger problem that completely encompasses the thing that you're talking about. So he'd be like, "Oh, here's a theorem that I figured out that will tell you all these things about the policy function just from features of the utility function, and you can just jump over big chunks of this problem." And I figured it out. And he's like, "If you want to use it in a paper, just let me know, and I'll write it up and publish it, and then you can cite it." So I spent a little time thinking about that stuff. But when I got connected with Martha was because my friend Jess Hoyle, who's like a development person in Colorado, had been working with her on some of the coding of like the early legal access to contraception laws.
Yeah.
And she was like, "Oh, Martha's got like a need for a short-term RA thing." So I did like a little kind of one-off hourly wage thing. I don't even remember what I was doing. I think I was coding family planning policy or legislation or something for her work on family planning, federally funded family planning centers. And then that was good. So then she said, "Okay, well, let's try something else." And we worked on another thing, another little short-term thing. And, we got along, and I was apparently doing good enough work to continue. And so then the next level of sort of the like job offer from Martha was like, "Okay, well, I think I got RA funding off a grant of hers for one of my semesters." And then this was like early in her time transitioning from postdoc to assistant professor, and then wading through and cleaning up all of the grant information that you can get on war on poverty programs. So she had like pioneered the use of this like archival data set of federal war on poverty grants. But it's trickier than that because it's pretty cool to have a archival file that just tells you like, here's all the grants and here's where they went and here's how much they were and here's what they were for. But the file's not that clean. So if you want to do a really good job of pulling out like one program at a time, you kind of need to check the file against all the primary sources you can get your hands on. So I was working on community health centers, which we wrote a paper on. And it was, you think you're going to go into this electronic data set, do a little string search thing and pull out the health center grants and be done, but you're not done. You got to go to libraries and archives and find like directories of community health centers and check like, there's a grant in Birmingham, Alabama in 1967, but is there actually a health center listed in Birmingham, Alabama in 1967? Like sometimes yes, sometimes no. So that was like a cool introduction to historical research.
Yeah.
Because that was a totally different skill than data cleaning or coding. It was a totally different skill than econometrics. It was just this willingness to sleuth and search and nail down these details. And that's something that I think I learned from getting drawn into economic history, which I love, is that people are gonna make you get those details right for the most part, and they know enough to know what the details are. Like they don't gloss over stuff.
Right.
And I love it. It's really cool.
Yeah. Did that kind of come naturally to you, being like enjoying that kind of thing? Were you?
Yeah, I think so. I don't know why. I mean, now I'm glad that I was inclined to do that, but I don't know what made me see this task. Figure out which counties received grants for community health center, how much, and in what year.
Yeah.
And then really chase it down and like doubt. Well, I don't know if that's quite right. Let me check this. I think the library part was fun. I really like the primary source material searching. And yeah, I mean, now I would explain it. Now I know more about econometrics, and I could say, well, of course it's very important to like minimize the level of measurement error in your right-hand side variable, but that's not what would have come out of my mouth in like 2009. I just thought it was fun to track it down, and I was like, well, we're supposed to do this correctly, so let's do it correctly.
Yeah. Right.
And it was fun.
Right. That's that you're getting that because that the culture or the mindset of the economic historians is that it's not it's not like for the necessarily the cleanness of the econometrics. It's just like this is what we do.
Yeah, I think so. And there's like Trevon Logan says like one of our most powerful methods is counting. And
Yeah.
a lot of the time that comes down to stuff like that. And that's just knowing what you're looking at and what you're working with and how to interpret like a number. I mean, you might have a table, but you got to know where that number came from. Like I remember sitting in an economic history talk and someone was talking about tractors. I mean, tractors are like an extremely important thing in American economic history. Like
Oh,
barbed wire is important, tractors are important, like mechanical cotton pickers are important. There's like these big, you can get really detailed about like where these come from and what they do. And someone had an ag census and they were talking about like tractors per farm. And someone raised their hand, they're like, but what does it mean when someone writes down that they have 2 tractors? Like, what does that actually mean? And it was a really good question. What do you count as a tractor? Like, how big is it? How powerful is it? Like, what jobs are you using it for? Do you need other attachments for the tractor to actually like use it to effectively increase your crop yield? I mean, it's an interesting question. And so you gotta get pretty detailed. You can't just pull that stuff down and be like, oh, 2 tractors is the answer, because that could mean a lot of things. And so it's a really nice complementarity between knowing a ton about like the context and the world that you're studying from and drawing that knowledge from like all sorts of places, and then having the skills to map that stuff to the economics and the empirical exercise that you're actually doing.
I have never thought about the tractor. I grew up in Mississippi and I'm surrounded by tractors, but the tractor was a really pivotal machine in economic
Yeah,
history culture.
yeah, I'm not going to remember the tractor sites, but there's lots of people who do this sort of American economic history and agriculture stuff. It's really fascinating.
Wow.
There's so many angles on it, and it's not just a matter of like downloading a data set and figuring stuff out. Like here's a good example. I just saw a talk at the Economic History Association, and I talked to the author after. She was great. I'm really sorry I forget the site here, but it was about this is like, you'll like this. It's like kind of Coasian. It's like it was about barbed wire, and it was about who is responsible for putting up a barbed wire fence. Is the rancher whose cattle will go eat the crops responsible for fencing in his cattle, or is the farmer whose crops will get eaten by the cows the one who's responsible for walling off his crop?
Yep.
And different counties would have different sort of like liability type rules and fence laws over time, and it would change, and it was really interesting.
Ah, so fascinating. Oh, yeah. Well, so Dinardo though, Professor Dinardo, he's not an economic historian, right?
No, but Dinardo thought about like tons of stuff. So I knew John in the band. So John was the keyboard player in the grad school band, and I started playing in that band in my first year. And so I would go over to Gary Solon's house every weekend for years. And John was a super interesting, charismatic, like just weird guy. I mean, John was someone in economics who he just had a different way of being in economics than most anyone else. I mean, his parents were Italian immigrants. He grew up in Allen Park, Michigan. He was like real plugged in. He was like big in the labor movement. And he had this point of view on labor economics, labor markets. I mean, he himself, like you should ask me no follow-up questions about this because I don't know a ton about it, but he would talk a lot about like how he was an anarcho-syndicalist, and he had like he advocated for like or he dreamed of a society organized around kind of like autonomous, like sort of worker collectives. So interesting, but yeah, I don't know. You talk to John, and the conversations would be wide ranging. It'd go from like labor stuff to like Harry Potter to how Italian anarchists would get blamed for things. Like sorry. Okay. So there was like this huge molasses flood in Boston in 1919. I don't know if you know about this. There was a huge vat of molasses and it exploded. It killed people. It like destroyed pieces of like rail equipment and stuff. It was a really big deal.
Molasses.
And molasses. Mm-hmm.
It's flammable, or what's the deal?
No, it just was a huge vat of the stuff, and
super hot.
Yeah, I think it was stored hot, but it was in the winter, so it was a cold day. And I don't know, it's a good question of why it was actually so damaging, but it was pretty bad. Like this molasses flood was no joke. And at first, the company blamed Italian anarchists for blowing it up. I mean, they did that. That's not what happened, but that was their knee-jerk thing. Was like, oh, the Italian anarchists did it.
That's
So, so John was like into the stuff like that.
it's
So
like defending their honor, right? 100.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So like talking to John was like that. You'd get a taste of just like everything. And so I got to know him in that way, just chatting and playing music together for years before I ever really talked to him about economics because I was doing first year stuff.
Yeah.
I was preoccupied with that. So then, he was just someone I liked and really cared about. So when it came time for me to pivot towards kind of research stuff, he was a natural person to just bring it up with. And he was a huge influence in terms of like thinking through causal inference and identification. And yeah, he was someone who I really wanted to hear his thoughts on like, things like the philosophy of science.
Yeah. Yeah.
He just was extremely widely read, and insightful about stuff like that. And so I got to know him that way. And then he had sort of 2 bouts of leukemia. So he was out and he had a bone marrow transplant after the first one. And he was like out of the classroom for a bit. So my interpretation of this period is that he wasn't like gaining new students during that time because he was kind of out, but I knew him through band stuff.
Right.
So then he had a period of time where he was like in relatively okay health. And so I got like a pretty large dose of John because he didn't have other new incoming students, but he and I were still connected.
Yep.
So I spent, especially when I finally settled on my job market paper about Medicaid, he and I would talk, we'd go sit at this restaurant and for like 5 hours and talk through it and talk about all this other stuff. He'd go smoke a cigarette, he'd come back in. And it was really, I remember that stuff very fondly. But it was fun too because he used to sort of describe his advising style as like a Columbo type of advising. Just see a little thread and just pull on it and keep pulling on it. And usually I'd go sit down and I'd have some kind of seemingly complicated question about standard errors or bootstrapping or should I do this other fancy thing? And he would be like, okay, just hold on. Can you just tell me like what is on the left-hand side of this regression?
Mm-hmm.
But typically asking questions like that was actually the right place to start. And usually you didn't even need to do the fancy thing you were thinking of. You just had to think through that a little more.
Yeah, right.
It was great. So, I guess he was influential to me in a lot of ways. Some technical, some not technical, like how do you navigate this profession as like, what are the different options for just like even getting through a life in econ? He had like a very different style of doing it than other people, which was super valuable to see. But then more technically, he was he was a really clear thinker on research design and identification. He showed me how to think about the philosophy of science and what you're doing at very high level, but connected to like practical stuff. And then even just the focus on like asking like these really simple questions about stuff first and not spinning your analysis up into something more complicated than needs to be. Like he was very good at that. Like even the reweighting paper is just a beautiful paper because you need some technical stuff to make it work, but the reweighting distributions is all about just showing something compelling and basically pretty simple in the end.
Mm-hmm. So this two-way fixed effects paper of yours, I kind of want to talk a little bit or a lot about it. So its birth is at Michigan, kind of earlier. It even seems like, right? It's not at the end.
Oh, definitely.
What's the origin of this paper?
Well, Martha and I had been working on this community health centers paper. And that is the way that paper works is we had data on county level mortality rates. You can get that back to 1959. And we had, from the archival exercise, we had information on like which counties received community health centers for the first time at which years. So perfect staggered timing. We had a ton of untreated counties, but we had 150, 200 maybe places that got them anywhere between 1965 and I think we stopped in about 1975, 74. So, we were doing two fixed expressions. Martha was, I think, this is some of her stuff at this era is pre this new diff literature, but like she was a super careful regression runner. We were doing two fixed effects because that's kind of like what you did at that time. But actually, let me just say, like, if you look at her family planning paper, she has a figure in the beginning that is the x-axis is calendar time, and there are 3 lines. The one line is the difference in fertility rates between kind of like early counties and never treated counties, right? So that's kind of like a Callaway and Santana thing. The second line is middle, counties treated like late 60s, early 70s, minus the never treateds. And then the third line is like the late treated ones minus the never treated. So 3 lines, each of which are approximations to like a well-defined diff and diff that we would talk about now. And she put that in there just because I think she was like a rigorous, sensible person who was like, well, this would be a good way, hands above the table, to show what the data show without doing, it's clear what I'm doing. Let's just show this.
Yep.
So she was bringing that level, of care to these regressions. And one specific way I can say that is, like, if you look in our community health centers paper, we never report like one diff and diff coefficient. We have these events, we have really good looking two-way fixed effects event studies. And then to the extent that we aggregate them, we do like little bins, like short run, long run, but we never fully went for like just one number because it kind of didn't make sense. Or I remember looking at versions of those event study estimates with and without county specific time trends. And all that happened is you took a really good looking event study and you put a time trend in, and it just rotated the whole thing around. And I remember being like, that's weird. I can get anything I want. I'll just put in a quadratic and it'll kind of put it through this funhouse mirror. That didn't seem right. So we didn't do that.
All right.
Anyway, but so we had these like results. We were like, this is amazing. This, we have good looking results. We have auxiliary data that suggests that there's like a pretty strong first stage. We have lots of evidence historical evidence on what these places were doing. Like these pieces of, this is like really coming together into a good story, meaningful experiment, strong results, like important interpretation in terms of how to improve health in poor areas.
Yep.
So it's time to write the thing up. And in the method section, there was a sentence, I think Martha wrote, we exploit variation in the timing of health center establishment. I remember reading it and thinking like, well, yeah, that's true. But there's, 2,900 untreated counties in this thing. Like, what are they doing?
Yeah.
So, and then it got changed for a little while to something like, we exploit variation in the location of health centers. And I thought, well, yeah, that's true too. But we also had some auxiliary stuff where we dropped the untreated counties. And so I was like, well, if that regression is spitting out coefficients, then there's something about the timing that matters too. It's like something that's both things. And so I really only have like one tool, which is the Frisch-Waugh theorem. So I just started like kind of trying to figure out what even a single regression coefficient could mean by just doing algebra, taking out the unit fixed effects, subtracting them from the treatment variable, subtracting the time fixed effects from the treatment variable, these means or whatever. And that was probably 2010, I bet, maybe 2011. No, it was 2010 because I remember we lived in DC for a year when SIA was on Council of Economic Advisors. And I remember sitting at our teeny weeny little table in our tiny DC apartment, like working on this. And I just kept on doing the algebra wrong. It's like kind of a pain to crank through it. And I was doing the algebra in kind of an inefficient roundabout way, but it started to like make a little bit of sense. I have some early stuff where I'm like, well, it's like this difference penalized by this difference. And it wasn't a clear way to express it, but it wasn't totally wrong. And then there was a time, then it just kind of went in my drawer. And I remember I got to Vanderbilt and it kind of had started settling on this average of diff and diffs, average of like 2x2 terms in some sense. And I gave a talk at Arizona, and I saw Gary Solon, and I was just, this was in my, he's so good at this stuff too. He's like a really clear econometric kind of empirical labor person. And I remember mentioning this, and he gave me some like, fair, sensible encouragement. He was like, oh, that's an interesting thing to think about. You should see if you can make something of it. And that came at the right time because I could have easily just put it away and just sat on the sidelines. But that encouragement from Gary was really helpful. And so I thought I'd return to it. And once I kind of settled on this, like once I figured out that I could write this as like an average of diff and diffs, I thought that was great because I was like, well, that makes sense. Right. A big diff and diff is an average of small diff and diffs. That's cool. Yeah. It always had an echo to me of like the Wald IV theorem. Like a big IV coefficient is like a linear combination of like little simple things.
Yep.
And it really, really, really made sense to me as someone who wants to understand complicated things in terms of simple things. I kind of think that's the only thing we really understand is when
Yeah,
you
yeah,
can.
yeah. Right.
So that felt good. But then the really, really, really key thing was being colleagues with Pedro Santana at Vanderbilt, because
Yeah.
it could have just been like a little note, like here's some algebra.
Yeah.
But talking to Pedro, I think I learned a huge amount about how to think about this type of estimator decomposition econometrically, and crucially, like how to map it to an estimand and causal parameters,
Yeah.
which is just not something I really understood very well in grad school. Actually, I was not good at working with potential outcomes or these kind of expected conditional expectations type derivations. I was like pretty intimidated by them, and I knew I should kind of understand them, but I didn't understand them that well. And once I had the definitive thing in hand, I was like, well, I know what these averages mean. This is good. And I can plug in this other type of potential outcomes notation. And that jump from estimator to a theoretical thing was really important for me, even putting together like how this mode of causal inference even works. I kind of didn't understand it that well back
Mm,
to say 2014, 15. And
mm.
it was like talking to Pedro and working through this example that like really made me better at it in a general way.
Yeah. Yeah. 2014. Wait, you're a professor in 2014?
Yeah.
Oh,
Oh no, I was a postdoc. Sorry.
you're a postdoc at
Yeah.
Vanderbilt?
At Berkeley. I was the last of the Robert Wood Johnson
Oh,
postdocs.
you were a Robert Wood Johnson fellow. I didn't know that. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Right. Right. You were doing it at Berkeley. Okay.
Hmm.
You've got this paper, you got this result that it's 4 diffs basically, or it's the early to never, late to never, early to late, late to never. So before you are working with Pedro, what'd you think about that late to never one?
I just thought it was an interesting thing in the data, and I
You
thought
weren't
just like,
problematic.
no, I don't think I had a good sense that it was problematic until I was able to plug in
The
the
potential out.
potential outcomes to it. Yeah, it was just like, here's a fact.
Would
Here's a
you
here's an
when you plugged it in and you saw it, what'd you think then?
I think it was a surprise that that could be screwed up in a certain way. I mean, I definitely was not using any words like this is biased for something or this is like wrong or off or attenuate. I wasn't using words like that when it was all algebra. It was like, this is what it is. Here, this is just a fact.
Yep.
And then once it was it's like you have to make that leap to using potential outcomes and talking about like theoretical quantities like treatment effect parameters or parallel trends assumptions, these things that like live up in theory heaven.
Yep.
You have to talk about those things to even say what bias is,
Yep.
and so that was really important. I mean, I think I remember like talking to Pedro about it, working on this thing. I was working like late on it one night, and I don't know, I went on a walk or something like that, and it kind of like crossed my mind, like, oh, I mean, this is like a simple thing. This is what, econometricians do already, but I just didn't even cross my mind before that I could like be combining this algebra that I had already done with like this notation that defines important quantities and defines causal effects, and I could put them together. I should have known it from the beginning, but I just don't. I think my ability to understand how econometrics works was kind of like flat for a long time, and then this experience was like a huge uptick in what I actually can even comprehend about how econometrics works.
You learn so much by doing, you know.
Oh yeah, I know.
I mean, it's like even it's hard to I mean, in some ways you want to say to the grad students, you want to say, look, it's learning by doing. So what, you got to do and you'll grow and change and there'll be personal growth and intellectual experiences that, are life-changing and truly enjoyable. And so this was one of these truly enjoyable things for you, I bet.
Absolutely. I mean, it's funny too, like, so people, when I talk about it, people, it's funny how reproducible this is. Like Pedro Santana, is like such a generous
Mm,
person with his time. He's a good communicator. I mean, he knows just like more than I'll ever know about this stuff.
Yeah.
And
Same.
so, I would go upstairs, like his office was right above mine, and I'd go up there and I'd like have some issue or I'd complain about something or we'd rant about something or I'd have some question, and he always had time for it.
Yeah.
And I think it was like the openness and the positivity plus the like deep well of knowledge was really important because I didn't feel put off. I didn't feel like I was burdening him or like I was saying something stupid. And so then that gave me the that made me feel like sort of like emotionally and socially willing to keep on thinking about it. I wasn't like put off or embarrassed, to go ask Pedro that stuff.
Wow.
And I'm always surprised at how that side of things shapes what you can learn and do and achieve. Like you need sort of a base of like certainty about your own position in the world to even like reach out and think new stuff. So it was like being able to talk and listen and with people with a lot of expertise in a way that I was like comfortable doing that helped me get here. So that's part of also why I know that you agree with this too, but why I think the communication is so important here. If we had no new differences papers, there would still be a huge amount of work to just communicate them effectively in a way that works for like many different people, many different styles, like people at different levels. That's a crucial job. If no one ever did that, these new lessons would just be like lost to history.
Yeah. So when did you, I totally agree. Yeah. When did you start to feel you were like, man, this paper might be influential, impactful. When did that start to happen? Because it's fair to say it's been a little life-changing, right?
Oh yeah, I don't think I'd be. Yeah, it's definitely changed like the trajectory of what I work on, what I think about, like internally. I can understand things now that I could never have understood if I didn't have this experience.
Yep.
And it's like the thing that people will know about my research more than anything else forever, probably.
I bet
Um,
I bet a lot of people even feel a certain level of gratitude even with the paper, which is, I'm just now thinking out loud, at least a lot of econometrics papers, you sort of feel, like, boy, this is kind of hard. This is like, I'm learning this for the prelims, and
yeah,
then it's really amazing when you're like, oh God, thanks so much for breaking this down into 4 different diffs, Then but I didn't realize how easy potential outcomes was. I mean, I think it really was the key that unlocked a lot of the other estimators even, I mean, it's like, because even though you don't provide in the paper a new solution, although sometimes it did kind of feel like in earlier versions there was more of a hint of like, here's a possible. I feel like that there's parts of the papers I don't really teach anymore.
yeah.
And I can't remember what it was. It was some other.
No, I think there used to be stuff where I would say, here is a decomposition of the 2A fixed effects estimand, and there's this variance weighted treatment effect parameter, and that's good in the sense that it's weighted by positive stuff
Yeah,
and that's good-ish. So like if you're happy with that, and then all the bad stuff comes from this comparing a units that get treated later to a control group of units that are already treated. But
yep,
if you know that and you do, Bacon decomp, you could just subtract the bad stuff and be
yeah,
left with a positive thing. I think I said that for a while and I was like, that's probably good enough.
yeah.
And I think I even
Get
like
it.
originally I was like,
You get the number in the bacon decomp. I mean, I guess you got to figure
yeah,
out error though, but like
yeah,
but otherwise you just like delete it. But it's
yeah.
not a parameter that you were really going after.
No, and I think that's another place where I didn't. I used to view this kind of statement as like a little bit pedantic and like me asking for too much or too detailed or too uptight, from econometricians. Like, well, you need to say the parameter that you want and then specifically target that thing.
Right.
I
Right.
didn't. I used to think like, okay, sure, but in reality, of course, we're not going to do that. We're going to run our regression and we hope it's kind of close. And that let's all agree that's good enough. And
Yeah.
that's something I think I've really changed about. Like now I understand better like how you can construct tools that do what you really want. So then you can do the thing that the econometricians want you to do. You can
You're not
say, this is the
happy.
parameter I want.
You're not gonna be happy when I say this, but like in a way, those old IV arguments in the 90s, like Heckman and others would be, I remember interviewing Embens and he would say, you know, he was talking about the late theorem and he would be like, we just kind of said, well, this is what you're getting with instrumental variables. You're getting the late. We're not saying it's good or bad. We're just saying this is what it is. And he said, well, he told me people didn't really quite like it, or some people didn't. And I was like, well, how come? I don't understand. Like, it's, you know, it's true. So why would you even have an opinion like that? And he said, you know, well, that wasn't what people did. They like said, this is the parameter and this is how you get it. And in a way, it's kind of like you kind of have a bit of a late paper, right? Like, cause
yeah.
you sort of are like, this is what you're getting. You're getting
Yeah.
the variance weighted ATT plus the variance weighted parallel trends plus this dynamic treatment effect. And if that's what you're wanting, which no one in the right mind wants, but you know, like that, if that's what you're wanting, then that's what you get. Right.
Yeah, totally. Actually, this is,
Like
I
a
think
late
the,
of diff and diff a little bit.
definitely. I think, and again, this experience let me look back at those 90s debates and understand them in a way that was much deeper than I used to. But
Yeah.
here's where I think the key distinction um, is in the sort of complexity of the design, you know, like how much stuff is varying.
Right.
So like the late theorem with a binary instrument is like, this is the causal, this is the, you know, this is the late for compliers. And there's like one set of compliers to the instrument. And
Yep.
that might not be exactly what you want, but it sometimes is what you want. You know, you can stick that into a marginal treatment effects Roy model framework and understand like just what this means.
Yep.
It's not going to be this, there's like not weird weighting stuff. It's just a specific population, but that's cool. You know, that's kind of cool. It's interesting. And I kind of love the way that the marginal treatment effects papers like encompass all the parameters and like put late in a broader context. That I think is very cool too.
Yeah, me too.
But then plug that into like a walled IV theorem and you've got some weird weighting stuff again. You know, you're going to weight by like how far apart are any two values of Z. And again, maybe that's not what you want. There's like variance weighting in there. So, and then in a staggered diff and diff, in a regular diff and diff, you don't have weird weighting stuff.
Yep.
You just get an ATT because there's only one group, just like binary late.
Yep.
But with a staggered diff and diff, you got multiple treatment groups. And so now you've got like many little, what Pedro calls, and now I like routinely call building block parameters. And then weighting matters and heterogeneity matters. And so, you know, if you're going to do super simple stuff, I think you don't have to worry as much about weird features of like that your estimator is giving you. Like use a regression, you get some weird stuff. If it's simple, the regression is a very simple like averaging machine.
Right.
But if it's complicated, the regression is a kind of weird contorted averaging machine. Yeah. And it might not be the machine that you want. So that's how I think about it now. And like you look at some of the stuff I've been working on with Pedro and Brant Calloway about continuous different diff designs. It's another one where continuous design is just like a lot of variation now along, not on the timing margin, but now on like intensity. And you can put that stuff through the OLS averaging machine and see that it also gives you some weird weighting properties. So it's something where now that I understand the tools that are more tailored to what you want to know, I understand how they work. And I have come to feel that they actually in the end are kind of like simpler under the hood than a regression coefficient is.
Totally.
I'm much more on board with the like, no, let's really like say what we want to know at the outset. And that has like other benefits, I think, for your analysis too.
Totally. Well, you know, me and you've talked a lot about this. I've really enjoyed the regression adjustment stuff. I did not know really. It's sort of like snuck up on me, and I'm going to have Timon on the talk because he's talked a lot about the connections with the OAXA blinder stuff. But like, you know, if you don't say up front, I want the ATE or I want the ATT, then you don't even do the regression right. You know,
totally.
You're like, this whole saturating. You're like, I heard somebody talk about saturating. I didn't know what the heck that was. And then like, then you do it in a simulation. You're like, well, wait a second. This one regression has two parameters. Which one do I want? And then you start to go, that's what's really I've been trying to kind of figure out how to tell people this in the seminar, the workshops. I'm like, you got to start with the parameter, because if you don't, then you won't even know in a regression what to do. But then you're like, you know, the first step is always, and I'd be curious how you phrase it, but like the first step of this whole, like what parameter, you know, you say, well, what's your research question? And a lot of people are like, oh, I know my research question. It's to estimate the effect of the minimum wage on employment. And you're like, well, there is no the effect. There's like, how many cities are in your data? You're like, 100. You're like, well, there's 100 of them. Well, so which one you want? You want it for all 100, or you want it for the ones that pass the law? And you're like, what the hell does that mean?
Yeah, right, exactly. I
You're
mean,
like,
you can even go
but he's
beyond
really
that and say like
thought that.
you don't even have to use averaging to summarize the underlying
The
unit level
summarize.
treatment effect. You could
Yeah.
say, I would like to know the median
Yeah.
of heterogeneous treatment effects, or I'd like to know the distribution of something. I'd like to know something about the distribution of like potential outcomes or something like that. So averaging already is like taking a stand on like what is a parameter that you would want.
Totally.
I think with the controls thing, the way I say it after I like read Timon Swetchinski's paper more closely and really like I don't know what made me turn to it one day, but I was so glad that I dug into it. And the like
Great writer.
Elder, Hyder, and Godira's paper that it builds on that's about Kitagawa Oaxaca blinder decompositions.
Yeah.
The way that I settled on saying it is like, I don't think that we even have a great definition of what it means to control for something in this context.
Yeah.
Do you want to, I think we should say adjust, but so suppose you want to, let's say adjust. Well, what do you want to do? Do you want to adjust the treatment group so that they look like the control group? And then the difference between them is like the treatment effect for untreated type of looking units? Or do you want to adjust the control group to look like the treatment group? And then the difference between them is the treatment effect for treated type of looking units. And so it's just kind of like, which one do you want to adjust to look like the other one? And this is funny because this is the kind of stuff that Dinardo would say to me years ago, and I didn't get it. I was not prepared to understand, interacting your X's with D, taking differences conditional on certain values of X. And you can look, and he's got like a little note. I think his website's actually still up. He's got like a 2002 note maybe on reweighting. You can make this point with reweighting really easily. Like get a P-score. You can reweight the controls to look like the treatment, get an ATT. You can reweight the treatments to look like controls, get an ATU. You can reweight both of them to look like the average, get an ATE. So he was making these points a long time ago, and it's just something where I really miss John, and I wish that I could. Now that I understand things he said to me 10 years ago, I wish I could go back and talk to him about it.
Yeah. So it is funny how when you think about the progression of IV even, and it's like when you move away, when you introduce heterogeneous treatment effects, it's funny how a lot of us, I think, I don't know if this is true, but I learned about two-way fixed effects in the panel econometrics. And then it was like the seamlessness with which you went into diff and diff. I mean, first of all, you could find different writers and they would say diff and diff, and then you'd find certain writers and they would just say fixed effects, and then it would be like they might not say diff and diff. They might just say I'm using fixed effects regression to estimate this policy parameter, which is consistent under strict exogeneity. And you're like, yeah. And then you'd read the diff and diff people. And this is a while ago, so it's like back, I think when I was in grad school, maybe you'd like just happen to run into somebody and they would say diff and diff, and then they'd say parallel trends, and you would go, I guess that's the same thing.
Yeah.
Strict exogeneity and parallel trends is the same thing. And I was like, I remember because if you didn't come from a potential outcomes background, you just were like always doing things in terms of the error term. And so you were kind of like, it's exogeneity. And since they're both consistent, they got to mean the same thing. They can't not mean the same thing. And so they don't mean the same thing. And so when did you first start to notice that?
I think it took a while actually, because I remember I wish I were better at proper panel econometrics. But the way I think about it is like, I think you're right. It's like focusing everything on the error term is tricky. Error terms are really tricky. I think the way that I started to square the circle here was that I dislike explanations of two-way fixed effects that are like, well, the unit dummies control for time invariant differences.
Yeah, right.
And the time dummies control for common shocks. I'm like, well, yeah, I see what you're saying, but
But they're doing some other.
I don't like the control for language never speaks to me because I know that they're because of I only know about the First-Law theorem. I
Well,
know that those things are modifying the other right-hand side variables. So just show me that instead. Like
totally.
show me like what you're taking out of the variation and what variation is left
At the
over.
Michigan thing, that's where you like they are like going around with the Frischwall level and just like hammering stuff with it.
I think so. I don't even
I really,
remember when I
I mean,
picked that up.
I of course learned it, but like, I mean, I'm just like a regular person. So I was like, I was like, just, it's in the textbook and then this is the answer. But you're like you're like you're digging into it.
Yeah, it made sense to me. It's my favorite theorem of all theorems for sure. I really, because it just like helped me take complicated things and turn them into other things. Like a good example is like I'll see papers that like control for even without going too detailed about it. Suppose I forget. I was in a talk the other day and someone was like regressing an outcome on maybe it was a continuous variable and some other x's. And I just wanted them to just partial the x's out of the continuous variable and then show me how much variation is left over. Or I discussed a paper at EHA where I was like, look, you have this continuous thing. Why don't you just partial the x's out of it and show me which states wind up like high and low on this sort of like adjusted variable? Just you can do that. And the Frisch-Wahl is like the key thing that's going to tell you like really which state is at the top of the cloud and the bottom of the cloud, like in the end.
Right.
And that kind of stuff I thought was very helpful.
Yeah, totally. Well,
but so oh no, I know the error term thing. The thing that really helped me was like, we think about the error term as other stuff.
Yeah.
But I think the thing I didn't appreciate is that treatment effect heterogeneity is in the error term if you specify like one coefficient only.
Yeah.
And sometimes you can get even sucked into like these like the style of analysis of like random coefficient models where you say, I would like the parameter that I want is the like average, and I'm going to assume that the treatment effect heterogeneity is just like normally distributed around the average, and so I've got some other noise in the error term, and so everything's fine. I think the thing I didn't understand is like when you do the fixed effects and you think about what they do to the treatment variable, time-varying treatment effects are like not orthogonal noisy heterogeneity. They're like super correlated with the treatment variable noise and super correlated with the treatment variable, and that's the way that I started to square the like panel language with like diff and diffy type language.
Yeah, totally. So there's probably still a lot of work to be done on the educating, I think, about that, because I touch on it in my seminars, but like I think that's really, I think people, Embeds and Rubin in their book, when they talk about exogeneity, they'll talk about, they have this whole thing in the matching chapter where they're like, here's exogeneity, and then the Embeds and them have a proof, and they're like, an exogeneity assumes actually unconfoundedness, constant treatment effects, and the functional form is right. And you're like,
oh, crap.
I didn't know that at all. And so, it's the same kind of deal. Well, hey, so let me talk about this thing, because I've kept you over, and I wanted to ask you a little bit. So you end up going to the Fed, and like, I think a lot of people, they think of I don't know if a lot of people do, but there's some people, I think they think of the Federal Reserve and they're like, oh, that must mean Bacon's a macroeconomist now, but or he's thinking about monetary policy. But you're in this interesting group at the Fed that Abby Wozniak sort of was kind of seminal in helping start. Can you tell us what that group is?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so the Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute, we are like a research unit in the Fed. I mean, here in Minneapolis, we're adjacent to and tightly related with the broader research department. And the origin, I think, was that Neil Kashkari came and was the president of the Minneapolis Fed and was making observations about things like Black unemployment is persistently 2 times as high as white unemployment. Good times, bad times, the ratio is like 2-ish almost all the time. And I don't think he felt satisfied with the answers he was getting about why that might be true. So he proposed a research institute within the Fed's system to study that kind of thing, that kind of inequality, either in terms of distributions or across groups. And then the feedback he got was like, yes, you can do it, but like put it in a regional bank, do it in Minneapolis. And so then they got Abby to come head it. And she's someone whose work I've liked for a long time. I just really like respect her. I'm super happy to get to work with her. And then, around 2019, like we were looking to move from Nashville. Like we're, as I may have inferred, like we're in our global max location at this point. And so that was really happy for our family. And I really like the Fed system a lot. I really, really love working in it. Like weirdly, like the existence of the dual mandate to like maintain stable prices and pursue maximum employment. Like it's very helpful to have that written down. Like that's why we're here. And it's pretty broad. Those are pretty broad things to say. They can plug into a lot. They can filter all the way down to like making sure you don't screw up your diff and diffs.
Yep.
But I love that that's there. So I value the Fed for that reason too. And so, yeah, I was really, and it was like very exciting to come be early on board with the Institute. So first it was like me and then trade macro person from Notre Dame named Ilan Kondo, who's wonderful. And then our next round of hiring was like Alex Albright, who it does fantastic, like reduced form kind of causal inference stuff in criminal justice. Malika Thomas does a lot of like personnel, labor type economics. And then Amanda Michaud as a sort of macro policy person.
Oh, so it's growing.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
it's great. It's really fun. And so like I think too, like counterfactual, where I'm still a professor, I spend a lot of time in office hours and I grade problem sets, and people don't like their grade on things. And now I spend that time like I write about research for the Institute. I write a lot of like public facing articles. And that means I get to read papers I would otherwise not read.
Right.
I do, the bank gets a certain amount of, we have a lot of trust, I think, locally in terms of doing evaluations of things. So I'm not involved in all of that, but I got to do an RCT for the city of Minneapolis about a guaranteed basic income program. So it's been, and then of course, the other part of it is that I get to interface with this entire half of the economics profession, like structural research, macro, that I otherwise was not going to. There was no incentive or reason for me to like go that direction, go to those talks before. And I've learned a ton from them. They have like a different sensibility about things sometimes, but it's really informative and I think broadening like my understanding of like what economics can do and how to use it and how to motivate things and exist in the profession.
Sandy Black said that too to me once. She said, when she served on the CEA, she was like learning the macro labor, which she would have never learned. Or maybe she said something like that, which is like, there's just a whole bunch of econ that, we're so, we're more siloed than we've ever been. And we're less siloed now than we'll be in 100 years, so it's like, so you end up, this is the last topic I want to talk about. You've moved into homelessness and you study homelessness now. Is that right? You've got this new project on homelessness?
Well, I mean, it's not yet filtered into like my research, although I have ideas about it. It came from some of the bank writing. So we have a twice yearly magazine called For All, which anybody can sign up for and get delivered to their home for free. It's beautiful. We get to produce it with all sorts of people across the bank. Like we have excellent public affairs folks who make sure that it just looks gorgeous and like comes across really nicely. We have writers that contribute to it. I mean, it's awesome. I really like reading it. So I took on the sort of lead article for our current issue because I was noticing that we had a lot of people at our conferences or visiting us who were doing something homelessness related. So like Elior Cohen is an economist at the Kansas City Fed who has like a sort of Judge IV type design looking at the effect of like getting immediate housing assistance versus kind of having to wait on other outcomes, subsequent kind of homelessness related public service use outcomes. Turns out it's good. Getting housing is good.
Yeah, I've heard about that.
This guy, Mike Cassidy at Rutgers, has stuff about like homeless children and what happens to their schooling outcomes if they're placed near or far like their existing school. Because sometimes the placements can be far flung. Like in New York City, you might be in a different borough.
Right.
And that's bad. Like staying in your area. Yeah. So these are like kids in homeless families who are getting placed in housing. And if the housing is far away, it's not as good for children's performance in school.
Distance matters from lots of stuff.
Yeah. I think you got to think of these kids as like, now you have to if you want to go to your school, you got to get on this bus and go really far, or your schooling might be disrupted. Or Isa Imroglu has like a structural model about how to think about homelessness because it's a really heterogeneous type population. There's a lot of cyclers, and
Yeah.
then there's people who slide into this like long-term chronic homelessness, and uh, for econ reasons, and then I think also like sort of practical psychosocial
Yeah.
drug treatment, like all sorts of other reasons. Those two populations need different things or will react differently to different types of interventions.
Yeah.
So it was a natural thing to write about because the Institute was like kind of just experiencing more homelessness research coming in. And so I got the chance to write this magazine article, which as a sidebar was super fun because you don't have to write in academic article style. You can do writing things. You can say, I want to write it this way because it would be evocative, and then you can do it. It's very fun. Um, so it got me thinking about that. But homelessness was always like adjacent to stuff I cared about anyway. So I
Yeah.
actually felt really glad to get to think about it because it filled in a gap for me. Like you and I have talked about deinstitutionalization.
Yeah.
That's related to homelessness.
Yeah.
A lot of the issues are medical, and that's related to Medicaid. There's a ton, it's really related to everything, and I came away convinced that it affects everybody to
Yeah.
differing extents, of course, but we're all kind of tied up in it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm sure it's very meaningful to work on
Yeah.
that. I mean, it's just gotta, even when you just do something descriptive, it just feels
Yeah.
like this really matters what I'm doing.
Yeah.
So I want to end with this. I want you to imagine that you could go back in time, or maybe he comes to you, and it's that young Bacon that's just pissed off about econ and economists, and he hasn't yet had his buddies talk to him. What do you think if he, you're at a coffee shop and he walks in and he doesn't know it's you, so y'all are just kind of striking
Right.
up a conversation and he hears you or you hear him just being agitated.
Yeah.
How would you talk
That's a
to
good
him, and
question.
how would you talk to him, and what do you think you'd tell him now that without
Uh,
telling your identity?
I don't know. That's a really good question. I think about this a lot. Like, could I even make my former self understand things that I now understand? Not even in terms of academia, just like wisdom or like things that are true about my life now that I could have never imparted. But I think probably that like 18-year-old probably would have needed to be handled with a little bit of care because I think there was probably like a lot of like egotism there. I think I was probably pretty wrapped up in like feeling like I think I just wanted to be making those points and feel smart about it. So I think I would. I think is related to the communication styles. I don't think having things asserted to me at that time would have been super convincing. I think I would have needed to have things shown to me, like here's what you can do if you are able to think this way.
Yeah.
But you, egomaniacal 18-year-old, of course you can do whatever you want. But like I would like to, I'm going to invite you to think like this. I think that's probably the style that I would have wanted.
I bet you would just be super friendly to him and super kind and super loving because I will say I've enjoyed our Slack channel, which
Mhm.
I think probably the best description of it is we're just kind of playing some D&D and not getting a lot of work done always.
I'm learning a lot,
You
Yeah,
have a
learn a
wizard
ton from you guys.
have a wizard channel. I
Yeah.
forgot
Yeah,
about
totally.
I started that wizard channel.
Yeah.
All right.
So
Well, go
hold
ahead.
on. I actually have a quote because I'm a longtime listener, first time caller to the podcast, and I have a quote for you actually
Oh yeah.
from a book that we've talked about, but that I'm reading right now is recommended by a friend called Microbe Hunters by this guy Paul de Cruyff. And it's this weird book from 1926 that's like going through the background of all these like early basically the development of germ theory.
Yeah, it's
And
downstairs. You told me about it and I ordered it. Okay,
it's so fun. So at the end of the book, this made me think of you a lot and like the way that you approach this podcast. So he's talking at the end, he gets all the way to the development of early antibiotics, or maybe it's written in 1926, so maybe he's not even there yet. But he says this. He says, "This plain history would not be complete if I were not to make a confession, and that is this: that I love these microbe hunters, from old Antony Leeuwenhoek to Paul Ehrlich, not especially for the discoveries they've made, nor for the boons that they've brought to mankind. No, I love them for the men they are, and I say they are, for in my memory, every man jack of them lives and will survive until this brain must stop remembering."
Mm,
And I read that paragraph and I thought about the way that you think about the history of economics and the people
yeah.
involved in it.
That's a great quote. That is totally encapsulate how I feel. I love you and I love I love our tribe, and but to love our tribe doesn't. I just love the people. I love the stories, and I love the authenticity of caring about people and going about it in a weird way. And that's great. That's a great quote. You have to send that to me.
Yeah.
Well, it's been so nice. I've just so thoroughly enjoyed our conversation, and of course, I love you very dearly,
Yeah.
and thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks. Well, you too, Scott. I really appreciate it. Nice talking to you.
All right.
Gotta see us through. Honey, you